It was a bitterly cold winter night, the kind where the wind cuts through layers of clothing and leaves even the hardiest souls shivering. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few hurried pedestrians clutching their coats tightly. Among them was a man in his late 60s, his face weathered by time but his eyes still kind. He walked with a slight limp, a reminder of an old injury, but his steps were steady. He had just left a small diner, where he'd spent another lonely evening sipping coffee and staring at the empty chair across from him, the chair where his wife used to sit. As he turned the corner, he noticed a figure huddled in a doorway, wrapped in a thin blanket. The man paused, his breath visible in the frosty air. The figure was a homeless stranger, shivering uncontrollably, his face pale and drawn. Without a second thought, the older man shrugged off his heavy coat and draped it over the stranger's shoulders. The homeless man looked up, his eyes wide with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. The older man simply nodded, patted him on the shoulder, and walked away, the cold biting at his arms but his heart feeling strangely warm. The next morning, as the sun rose weakly over the city, the man reached for his coat before remembering he'd given it away. He smiled faintly, thinking of the stranger. But as he prepared to leave his apartment, something caught his eye. On the floor by the door was a small, crumpled piece of paper. He picked it up, unfolding it carefully. It was a note, written in shaky handwriting, "You'll understand soon. Check the pocket." Confused, he grabbed the spare coat he'd worn home the night before and checked the pockets. His fingers brushed against something small and hard. He pulled it out, a key, old and tarnished, attached to a faded tag with an address scrawled on it. His heart began to race. What was this? And how had it ended up in his coat? The man stood there, staring at the key, his mind racing with questions. Who was that homeless stranger? Why had he left this behind? And what could possibly be waiting for him at that address? Little did he know, this simple act of kindness had set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. The man sat heavily in his armchair, the key still clutched in his hand. His apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that seemed to echo with memories. He glanced at the framed photo on the side table, a picture of him and his wife, taken years ago on a sunny beach. Her smile was radiant, her eyes full of life. He missed her every day. His name was Henry, though few people called him that anymore. Most of his friends had drifted away over the years, and his children lived in different states, busy with their own lives. Retirement had been harder than he'd expected. He'd spent decades working as a mechanic, his hands always busy, his mind focused on solving problems. But now, the days stretched out before him, empty and unchanging. He filled them with small routines, morning walks, trips to the diner, and occasional visits to the library. But it wasn't enough. He felt adrift, like a ship without an anchor. Henry's wife, Margaret, had been his anchor. She was the one who had encouraged him to slow down, to enjoy life. "You've worked hard," she used to say. "Now it's time to live." But when she passed away 5 years ago, something in Henry had broken. He'd always been a man of few words, but without her, the silence felt suffocating. He'd tried to keep busy, to find purpose, but nothing seemed to fill the void she left behind. The act of giving his coat to the homeless man had been instinctive, something Margaret would have done without hesitation. She had always believed in helping others, even when they had little to give. Kindness costs nothing, she'd say, but it can mean everything. Henry had thought of her as he'd walked away from the stranger, the cold air biting at his skin. It was the first time in years he'd felt a flicker of something, hope, maybe, or purpose. But now, sitting in his quiet apartment with the key in his hand, Henry felt a different kind of unease. The note, the key, the address, it all felt like a puzzle, one he wasn't sure he had the energy to solve. Yet, something about it tugged at him, a sense that this was more than a coincidence. He thought of the homeless man's face, the way he'd looked at Henry with something like recognition. Had he known Margaret? Was this somehow connected to her? Henry's mind raced with possibilities, each one more far-fetched than the last. He thought about ignoring it, about tossing the key in a drawer and forgetting the whole thing. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. Margaret had always believed in signs, in the idea that the universe had a way of guiding you when you needed it most. Maybe this was her way of reaching out to him, even now. With a sigh, Henry stood up and grabbed his jacket. He didn't know what he would find at the address on the key, but he knew he had to go. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of curiosity, a sense that his life might still hold surprises. And as he stepped out into the cold morning air, he couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret was watching over him, guiding him towards something he couldn't yet understand. The address on the key led Henry to an old part of town, a neighborhood of crumbling brick buildings and narrow, winding streets. He parked his car and walked slowly, the key clutched tightly in his hand. The address matched a small, weathered building with a faded sign above the door, Veterans Outreach Center. Henry hesitated, staring at the sign. What connection could this place have to the homeless man, or to him? Inside, the center was warm and bustling, a stark contrast to the cold, quiet streets outside. A few older men sat at tables, chatting over cups of coffee, while others browsed shelves of donated clothing. Henry approached the front desk, where a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor greeted him. "Can I help you?" she asked. Henry held up the key. "I found this," he said. "It was given to me by a man I met last night. He was homeless, and I gave him my coat. He left this behind." The woman's expression softened. "That sounds like Joe," she said. "He's been coming here for years. Quiet man, keeps to himself. But he's always been kind, even when life hasn't been kind to him." "Joe?" Henry repeated, the name unfamiliar but somehow comforting. "Do you know where he is now?" The woman shook her head. "He hasn't been here in a few days. But he left something for you." She reached under the desk and pulled out a small, worn envelope. "He said if someone came looking for him, to give them this." Henry took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. He opened it carefully, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was the same as the note he'd found earlier, but this time, the message was longer. "If you're reading this, it means you found the key. I don't have much time to explain, but I need your help. The key opens a locker at the bus station downtown. Inside, you'll find something that belongs to you. I've been carrying it for a long time, waiting for the right moment to give it back. Please, don't give up on this. There's more to your story than you know." Henry read the note twice, his mind racing. What could possibly be in a locker at the bus station? And why had Joe been carrying it? He looked up at the woman behind the desk. Did Joe say anything else? Anything at all? She hesitated, then nodded. "He said to tell you. Margaret would have wanted you to know." Henry's breath caught in his throat. Margaret. His wife's name. How did Joe know her? And what could he possibly have that belonged to Henry, or to Margaret? The woman's voice broke through his thoughts. "Joe's a good man," she said gently. "If he left this for you, it's important. Don't let it go." Henry nodded, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he couldn't turn back now. The bus station was his next stop, and whatever he found there, he knew it would change everything. The bus station was a sprawling, chaotic place, filled with the hum of voices and the screech of brakes. Henry moved through the crowd, the key clutched tightly in his hand. His heart pounded as he approached the rows of lockers, each one identical and nondescript. He found the number etched on the key's tag, Locker 217, and inserted the key with trembling fingers. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. Inside was a small, weathered box, the kind used to store important documents or keepsakes. Henry lifted it out carefully, his hands shaking. He carried it to a nearby bench and sat down, the weight of the box feeling heavier than it should. He hesitated for a moment, then opened it. Inside was a stack of old letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. On top of the stack was a photograph. Henry picked it up, his breath catching in his throat. It was a picture of Margaret, younger than he'd ever known her, holding a baby in her arms. She was smiling, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Henry had never seen before. On the back of the photo, written in her familiar handwriting, were the words, "My greatest joy and my deepest regret." Henry's hands trembled as he untied the ribbon and began to read the letters. They were from Margaret, written decades ago, addressed to someone named Daniel. The words were filled with love and longing, but also with heartbreak. As he read, the pieces began to fall into place. Margaret had been young when she'd had the baby, barely out of high school. Her family had pressured her to give the child up for adoption, and she'd reluctantly agreed. She'd named him Daniel and had written these letters over the years, pouring out her love and regret, though she'd never sent them. She'd kept them hidden, a secret she'd carried with her even after she met Henry. Henry's mind raced. He'd known Margaret had a past, of course, everyone did, but she'd never spoken of a child. He felt a pang of sadness, imagining the weight she must have carried all those years. But why had Joe been holding on to these letters? And how had they ended up in a locker at the bus station? As he sifted through the box, he found one more letter, this one addressed to him. It was from Joe, written in the same shaky handwriting as the notes he'd left behind. Henry unfolded it and began to read. "Henry, if you're reading this, it means I've kept my promise. Margaret was my sister. She made me swear that if anything ever happened to her, I would make sure you knew the truth about Daniel. She loved you more than anything, but she couldn't bring herself to tell you about him. She was afraid you'd see her differently, that it would change what you had together. But she wanted you to know, in case Daniel ever came looking for her, or for you. I've been carrying these letters for years, waiting for the right time to give them to you. I hope you can forgive her, and me, for keeping this from you. She loved you, Henry. And she trusted you to do the right thing." Henry sat there, the letter in his hands, his mind reeling. Margaret had a son. A son she'd given up before they'd met. A son who might still be out there, somewhere. And Joe had been her brother, a man who'd carried her secret for years, even as he struggled with his own demons. Tears welled in Henry's eyes as he thought of Margaret, of the pain she must have carried all those years. He felt a surge of love for her, mixed with a deep sadness for the life she'd kept hidden. And he felt something else, too, a sense of purpose. If Daniel was out there, Henry owed it to Margaret to find him. To tell him about the mother who had loved him so much, even from afar. He closed the box and stood up, his heart heavy but determined. The journey ahead would be difficult, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. Margaret had trusted him to do the right thing, and he wouldn't let her down. Henry left the bus station with the box tucked securely under his arm, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The letters and the photograph felt like a bridge to a past he hadn't known existed, a part of Margaret's life she'd kept hidden from him. He didn't feel anger, only a deep, aching sadness for the pain she must have carried all those years. And now, he felt a responsibility to honor her memory by finding Daniel, the son she'd never stopped loving. But where to start? Henry had no idea where Daniel might be, or even if he was still alive. The adoption had taken place decades ago, and Margaret's letters offered no clues about where Daniel had ended up. Henry's first thought was to return to the Veterans Outreach Center. If Joe had been Margaret's brother, perhaps someone there could help him piece together more of the story. When he arrived, the woman at the front desk recognized him immediately. "Back so soon?" she asked, her tone gentle but curious. Henry nodded, setting the box on the counter. I found what was in the locker, he said. Letters from my late wife, Margaret. And a photograph of her with a baby, her son. Joe was her brother. He left these for me. The woman's eyes widened. Joe never mentioned having a sister, she said. But then again, he didn't talk much about his past. He was a private man. Do you know anything else about him? Henry asked. Anything that might help me find Daniel, Margaret's son? She thought for a moment, then nodded. Wait here. She disappeared into a back room and returned a few minutes later with a file folder. We keep records of the veterans who come here, she explained. Joe didn't have much, but there might be something in here that could help. Henry pored over the file, his heart sinking as he realized how little there was. Joe had listed no next of kin, no emergency contacts. But there was one detail that caught Henry's eye, an old address, scribbled in the margin of a form. It was in a nearby town, one Henry had never visited. It's not much, the woman said apologetically. But it's a place to start. Henry thanked her and left, clutching the file. The address led him to a small, run-down house on the outskirts of town. The yard was overgrown, and the windows were dark. Henry knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He was about to leave when a neighbor emerged from the house next door, an elderly woman with a curious expression. Looking for Joe? She asked. Henry nodded. Do you know where he is? The woman sighed. Joe passed away last week. He'd been sick for a while, but he didn't want anyone to know. He was a proud man. Henry's heart sank. Joe was gone. The last link to Margaret's secret, the man who had carried her letters for years, was no longer here to guide him. But the neighbor's next words gave him a glimmer of hope. He left something with me, she said. Said if anyone came looking for him, to give it to them. She disappeared inside and returned with a small, sealed envelope. Henry opened it to find a single sheet of paper with a name and a phone number, Daniel Carter. Start here. Henry's hands trembled as he stared at the name. Daniel Carter. Margaret's son. Could this really be him? He dialed the number, his heart pounding as the phone rang. A man's voice answered, deep and cautious. Hello? Henry hesitated, then spoke. My name is Henry. I'm looking for Daniel Carter. There was a long pause. This is Daniel, the man said slowly. Who are you? Henry took a deep breath. I think I might be your stepfather. The line went silent for what felt like an eternity. Henry held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice cautious but tinged with curiosity. My stepfather? I don't understand. My mother's name was Margaret. She passed away years ago. Henry's throat tightened at the mention of Margaret's name. Yes, he said softly. Margaret was my wife. I didn't know about you until recently. She never told me. There was another pause, and Henry could almost hear the wheels turning in Daniel's mind. How did you find me? Daniel asked, his tone guarded. Henry explained everything, the homeless man, Joe, the letters, and the key that had led him to the locker. Joe was your uncle, he said. Margaret's brother. He left these things for me to find. He wanted me to know about you. Daniel exhaled sharply. This is a lot to take in, he said. I always knew I was adopted, but I never knew anything about my birth mother. I tried to find her once, but I hit a dead end. Henry's heart ached for the man on the other end of the line. I have letters she wrote to you, he said. And a photograph. She loved you, Daniel. She never stopped thinking about you. There was a long silence, and for a moment, Henry wondered if Daniel had hung up. But then he heard a quiet, almost imperceptible sniff. I don't know what to say, Daniel admitted, his voice cracking. This is all so sudden. I understand, Henry said gently. I don't want to overwhelm you. But I'd like to meet you, if you're willing. I think we both have a lot of questions. Daniel hesitated, then agreed. They arranged to meet at a coffee shop in the city the following day. Henry hung up the phone, his hands still trembling. He felt a mix of emotions, relief, anxiety, and a deep, aching sadness for the years Margaret had spent carrying this secret. But he also felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was a chance to honor her memory and bring some closure to a story that had been left unfinished for far too long. The next day, Henry arrived at the coffee shop early, clutching the box of letters and the photograph. He sat at a corner table, his eyes scanning the door every time it opened. Finally, a man walked in, tall, with Margaret's eyes and a quiet, reserved demeanor. Henry's breath caught in his throat. There was no mistaking it. This was Daniel. Daniel spotted him and approached the table, his expression a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Henry, he asked. Henry stood, extending his hand. Daniel. It's good to finally meet you. They shook hands, and for a moment, neither of them knew what to say. Finally, Henry gestured to the box on the table. These are for you, he said. Letters from your mother. She wrote them over the years, though she never sent them. She wanted you to know how much she loved you. Daniel sat down, his hands trembling as he opened the box. He picked up the photograph first, staring at the image of Margaret holding him as a baby. Tears welled in his eyes as he flipped through the letters, each one filled with Margaret's love and regret. I never knew, he whispered. I never knew she cared this much. Henry reached across the table, placing a hand on Daniel's arm. She did, he said. And so do I. I know this is a lot to take in, but I want you to know that you're not alone. You have family, Daniel. You have me. Daniel looked up, his eyes filled with tears. Thank you, he said quietly. For finding me. For telling me the truth. Henry nodded, his own eyes glistening. It's what Margaret would have wanted. The protagonist sat in the dim light of his study, the letter trembling in his hands. The weight of its contents pressed heavily on his chest, each word unraveling a secret his late wife had carried to her grave. He took a deep breath and began to read. The letter was written in her familiar handwriting, soft and flowing, but the words were heavy with regret and longing. She confessed something she had never shared with him during their years together. Before they met, she had given up a child for adoption. It was a decision made in desperation, born of youth and circumstance, and one she had buried deep within her heart, never daring to speak of it. The child, a boy, had been adopted by a military family. She had kept tabs on him from afar, watching as he grew into a man she would never know. She wrote of the ache she felt every year on his birthday, the guilt that never faded, and the love she still carried for the son she had let go. But she had never reached out, fearing the pain it might bring to both of them. The protagonist's breath hitched as he read on. The letter revealed that the homeless man he had encountered was not a stranger at all. He was the adoptive brother of the son his wife had given up. The man had been searching for him, driven by a promise he had made to his late brother, a promise to find the man who had unknowingly been a part of their family's story. The pieces began to fall into place. The homeless man's cryptic words, his insistence on speaking to the protagonist, his knowledge of the past, it all made sense now. He hadn't been a random stranger, he had been a messenger, a bridge between two worlds that had been kept apart for decades. The protagonist's mind raced. If the homeless man was the adoptive brother of his wife's son, then that meant, the son, his stepson, was out there somewhere. A man he had never known, a piece of his wife's life that had been hidden from him. And the homeless man, the one he had dismissed and ignored, was the only link to that lost part of her. He leaned back in his chair, the letter slipping from his fingers. The room felt too small, the walls closing in as the enormity of the revelation settled over him. His wife had carried this secret for years, and now it had found its way to him in the most unexpected way. He thought of the homeless man's weathered face, his piercing eyes, and the urgency in his voice. He hadn't been a nuisance, he had been a man on a mission, a man trying to honor a promise. The protagonist's heart ached with a mix of sorrow and hope. He had spent so long grieving his wife, clinging to the memories of their life together. But now, there was a new thread to follow, a new chapter to uncover. He realized that the homeless man might have been more than just a messenger, he might have been family. His stepson's brother. A connection to a past he never knew existed. As the weight of the revelation settled, the protagonist made a decision. He would find the homeless man. He would listen to his story, not as a stranger, but as someone who shared a bond he had only just begun to understand. And perhaps, in doing so, he would find a way to honor his wife's memory and the son she had loved from afar. The mystery of the letter had been resolved, but it had opened the door to a new journey, one that would take him deeper into the past and closer to a truth he had never imagined. And as he rose from his chair, the letter clutched tightly in his hand, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years, hope. The protagonist stood in the quiet of his study, the homeless man's coat draped over a chair. He had searched the pockets earlier, hoping to find some clue, some way to locate the man who had vanished as quickly as he had appeared. His fingers brushed against something stiff in the inner lining, a small, hidden compartment. Carefully, he pried it open and pulled out a faded photograph. The image was worn at the edges, but the details were clear. It was a young man in a military uniform, standing tall and proud, his face a striking blend of strength and softness. The protagonist's breath caught in his throat. There was something achingly familiar about the man's features, the curve of his jaw, the shape of his eyes, the faint smile that seemed to carry a quiet resilience. He looked just like her. Like his late wife. His hands trembled as he held the photo closer. This wasn't just any young man, this was her son. His stepson. The child she had given up, the one she had written about in the letter. The one he had never known existed until now. The resemblance was uncanny, as if a piece of her had been preserved in this stranger's face. But as he stared at the photo, a sinking feeling began to take hold. The uniform, the solemnity in the young man's expression, it all pointed to a story that had already reached its end. He turned the photo over and found a handwritten note on the back, in memory of Corporal Daniel Hayes, 1985 to 2007. Gone but never forgotten. The room seemed to spin. Daniel Hayes. His stepson. The boy his wife had given up, the man he had never met, had died in service years ago. The weight of the revelation crashed over him like a wave. He had been searching for answers, for a connection, but now he was faced with the crushing truth, he was too late. Daniel was gone. The protagonist slumped into the chair, the photo still clutched in his hand. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the story. The homeless man hadn't just been carrying the letter, he had been carrying this photo, too. A photo of his adoptive brother, a man who had died too young, a man who had never known his birth mother or the stepfather who now held his image. The homeless man's actions suddenly made sense. He hadn't been searching for the protagonist out of curiosity or malice. The protagonist stood outside the Veterans Center, the photo of Daniel Hayes tucked safely in his pocket. The weight of the past few weeks still lingered, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it had become a catalyst, a reason to move forward, to do something meaningful. He had spent too long living in the shadow of his grief, but now, he felt ready to step into the light. Inside the center, the hum of activity was both comforting and invigorating. Men and women in various stages of rebuilding their lives filled the space, their stories etched into their faces. The protagonist had come here to honor the homeless man's memory, to find a way to give back to the community that had shaped Daniel's life and, in turn, his own. He had signed up to volunteer, not knowing what to expect but feeling a quiet determination to make a difference. As he helped serve meals and listened to the veterans' stories, he began to see the world through a new lens. These were people who had faced unimaginable challenges, yet they carried on with resilience and hope. He thought of Daniel, who had served his country with pride, and of the homeless man, who had carried his brother's memory with such devotion. Their lives, though marked by loss, had been defined by purpose and connection. Over time, the protagonist found himself forming bonds with the people he met at the center. He shared his own story in fragments, finding solace in the understanding nods and shared silences. He realized that grief, in all its forms, was a universal experience, but so was the capacity for healing. Through small acts of kindness, a listening ear, a warm meal, a simple smile, he began to feel a sense of belonging he hadn't known he was missing. One evening, as he sat with a group of veterans sharing stories, one of them turned to him and said, "You know, it's funny. Sometimes, the people who seem to have the least to give end up giving the most." The words struck a chord deep within him. He thought of the homeless man, who had nothing by society's standards but had given him the greatest gift of all, the truth. A truth that had reshaped his life and given him a new sense of purpose. As the weeks turned into months, the protagonist found himself transformed. The weight of his grief had not disappeared, but it had softened, making room for gratitude and hope. He had come to understand that life was not about the grand gestures but the small, meaningful moments that connected people to one another. The homeless man's act of kindness, carrying the letter and photo, searching for him, had set off a ripple effect that had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined. One day, as he left the Veterans Center, he paused and looked up at the sky. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the city. He thought of his wife, of Daniel, of the homeless man, and of all the lives that had intersected with his own. He felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that their stories would live on through him and the work he was doing. As he walked home, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. It had been filled with pain and uncertainty, but it had also been a gift, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is light to be found. And sometimes, that light comes from the most unexpected places. The protagonist smiled to himself, a quiet sense of fulfillment settling in his heart. He had learned that life's greatest lessons often come wrapped in the most unlikely packages. And as he stepped into the next chapter of his life, he carried with him a simple but powerful truth: sometimes, the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places.